Good morning, friends. This is another edition of the Passball Show brought to you by JohnPLA.com, by St. Aloysius Church in Jackson, New Jersey, by Two Ways, One Passion Food Truck located in Scranton, Pennsylvania. As always, a handful of stuff we're going to get into today in the world of baseball, sports, and unifying America. A little bit, I'm going to talk about and once again reiterate my points about the reason why pitchers will never be able to hit in any professional league again. And there's so many different aspects to this that get broken down, but a lot of it is generic talking points of, oh, it's not as exciting for the game. There's an actual reason that the game of baseball will never be the same, and at some point, it's inevitable. There's going to be a designated hitter at every level of baseball that's played. NCAA Sweet 16. If you're looking at some of the teams there, obviously there are some surprises. One of the things that stands out about the tournament this year is the fact that we had such a misconception about how strong of a conference the Big Ten was. CBS was the network of the Big Ten. They throw a game with whether it's Michigan, Ohio State, Illinois, Purdue, Michigan State in your face every week. And you were kind of deceived into thinking that this was the best conference in the entire sport. Have you seen the Pac-12? Have you seen their performance in a field of 64? The NCAA tournament obviously expanded to 48, the whole thing. We'll talk about that in a little bit. And then once again, I'm going to get on my train and talk about, if you want to be active on social media, you should have the balls to identify who you are. But I'm going to start out, and I'd obviously be remiss if I didn't bring up and discuss the great career of one of the best basketball players of all time, and that's Elgin Baylor. Elgin Baylor passed away this week at the age of 86. And you think of the greats when it comes to the NBA. There's Michael and LeBron, and there's Wilt Chamberlain and Bill Russell and Kareem, and it's hard to say where you really feel Elgin Baylor should rank. And the one thing that sucks when you're trying to remember how great Elgin Baylor was is that he played in the shadow of a couple of the greatest players to ever play basketball of all time. And you can make a very reasonable case that there was no more dominant player in the history of the National Basketball Association than Wilt Chamberlain. Wilt Chamberlain was 7'2", towered over just about everybody, and over the course of his career, just dominated the sport. It was like an unfair game. It was almost like you had to put a handicap on the other side just to make things even, because the other team had Wilt Chamberlain and he was that dominating. We could talk all day about what it's like to average 50 points a game in a season, be the rebounder that Wilt Chamberlain was. It was like a man playing amongst boys. So you look at Jerry West and the type of scorer that he was. And Jerry West was another one of the game's most underrated players. Just a pure shooter. You think of the likes of Steph Curry now, who we think of as the game's premier shooter. That was Jerry West in his prime. So a team that had Wilt Chamberlain and Jerry West could not possibly, in the mind of most, have another player that could be in the top 10 or amongst the top 10 all time when it comes to the best basketball players ever. Going from the 1940s to now in the year that we're in right now. So why would that thought even be possible? Then you start to look at the career of Elgin Baylor. As solid of a scorer as he was, averaging 35 points a game over 3 seasons on a team that, by the way, once again had Wilt Chamberlain and Jerry West. Chamberlain was the dominant force. You're going to give the ball to, he's going to get to the basket, and he's going to rebound. Jerry West is going to hit a shot from anywhere. You know what Elgin Baylor brought to the table? The fact that he could take the ball to the basket at any time. The fact that he could get by anybody. He could bring the ball up. Yeah, sure, he could dish it out if he needed to. But the most important thing was that he was going to find a dynamic way to get to the basket. And that's what he did well. He was Dr. J before Dr. J, which obviously has been brought up 100 times already. But, Elgin Baylor, you look back and you're like, man, you call him a tertiary player on those great Laker teams. And which, by the way, you're looking at a time where the Celtics were winning championships. Bill Russell is one of the greatest basketball players of all time because of the amount of championships that he won. Now, he was a great leader on the court. Those teams don't win the championships without him. And I feel like Bill Russell gets a lot of the credit that he deserves. Now, from the contemporary basketball fan, maybe not. Maybe the basketball fan that's only seen LeBron James and Kevin Durant play, maybe goes back to a little bit of Michael Jordan, heard of him, kind of knows who Kobe Bryant is. Maybe that fan doesn't understand the levity of how great some of the basketball players of Christmas past were. But nobody won in the history of basketball like Bill Russell. When you think of Bill Russell and the amount of championships that he won in the NBA and the fact that he was a pure winner, you start to think of Tiger Woods and Jack Nicklaus. You start to think of Roger Federer and Serena Williams. Winners like that, like just the mere fact that they are on a court or are present in a given game, there's a good chance they're going to win just because they are there. Michael Jordan won 6 championships in the NBA. LeBron James has won, 4 now? Kobe Bryant won 5. You never got the sense that just because they were on the court, they were winning. Michael Jordan's comeback year when he was wearing number 45, they fell a little short of making the finals. We talk about the 6 championships in 8 years, and obviously one of the great feats that you've seen in the history of basketball. When Bill Russell was on the court with those Celtic teams, whether his teammates were Bob Cousy and Dave Cowens, Sam Jones or Casey Jones or John Havlicek, you knew because Bill Russell was there, that team was going to win. And then you go and you think of the tertiary players on that team. And if you mistakenly identify the Lakers' Elgin Baylor as a tertiary player, you are severely misunderstanding how great Elgin Baylor was. Once again, Dr. J kind of is a staple, is a significant element of the old ABA. He's part of what made the ABA into what the popularity that it became. And obviously led the Sixers to the NBA Finals and championships in the 1980s. Was a dynamic scorer. Elgin Baylor didn't get that type of respect because he played in the shadows of Wilt Chamberlain and Jerry West. And sometimes you stumble across it and you're just like, you know what? There's a couple players on the court on my own team that are a little bit better than me. But once again, from a historian standpoint, you don't want to mistake that and not identify that player for as great as they were. And I don't think Scottie Pippen is in the same league as Elgin Baylor, but I can make a fair enough comparison if you're a modern day fan. Scottie Pippen, if he was the star player on his own team, may have won some championships, would have certainly been the best player on his team, and probably would have been looked at as one of the better all-around players in NBA history. When I think of Scottie Pippen, I really do think of top 20 when it comes to the best basketball players of all time. And you could say, well, Scottie Pippen never ran his own team. An offense was never centered around Scottie Pippen. He played in the shadows of Michael, but without Scottie Pippen, Michael Jordan and the Bulls don't win those 6 championships. And he was very far from a role player. He was a significant scorer. When you think of LeBron James and Dwayne Wade and Chris Bosh in Miami, winning 2 championships and getting to 4 straight NBA Finals, you think of Scottie Pippen having that type of impact. Whether you said Dwayne Wade was number 1 or LeBron James was number 1 in Miami, one of those guys was number 2, but the number 2 was just as significant and important to the success of that team. And that's what you say about Scottie Pippen. And Scottie Pippen, once again, He is one of the more underrated players. I think Jerry West is underrated. I think very much Elgin Baylor is underrated. And Scottie Pippen, you got to think of in the same light. But there's a difference between somebody that's just a role player or a guy that was just there to help. John Paxton, Robert Horry, those were good role players. The Lakers aren't the Lakers without Elgin Baylor. And you can make a case that the Lakers don't win the championships that they win if Elgin Baylor isn't part of it. And I think you'd be remiss if you were talking about a top 10 all-time NBA basketball players and not include Elgin Baylor. I think he's pretty close. And if you want to say, maybe he's number 11. Maybe he's number 9. I put Kobe Bryant in there. Oscar Robertson. Bob Pettit, who I think we forget about, how great Bob Pettit was. And the great George Mikan. Another conversation you could have when it comes to basketball and basketball history. Do you really understand your basketball history if you don't understand the significance of George Mikan? What he meant to the sport. And the fact that a young game in the 1940s and 50s had never had a star like George Mikan before. Could George Mikan survive in today's NBA game? We could talk about that like Babe Ruth hitting a 104-mile-an-hour fastball. You can't transplant people from different times, but we could acknowledge that some were the best at the very time that they played. There was nobody better than George Mikan when George Mikan played. And like I said, if you just look at that name and say, hey, whatever, dude, he's not in the same category as any of these 20 or 30 players that I name when it comes to great basketball players, you should do some more research on George Mikan. You should also do some more research on Elgin Baylor. Because I think it's very easy to get caught up in the fact that those Laker teams were so stacked and they had Wilt and they had Jerry West. Later on had Kareem. The Lakers are always blessed or always seem to be blessed with the best players. LeBron ends up playing for them. Like I said, Kareem. They got Magic Johnson, Kobe Bryant. Shaq ends up going there. Karl Malone tries to win a championship there. We understand what the Lakers mean for basketball. And by the way, this to not set off another, hopeless debate, the Los Angeles Lakers are a more significant basketball team than the New York Knicks. We talk about Madison Square Garden, and maybe Madison Square Garden is the greatest arena, the arena that best signifies what a big basketball game should be played in. There is no more important team to the NBA than the Los Angeles Lakers. But rest in peace, Elgin Baylor, one of the greats of all time. To save these corny Oral Roberts jokes, I always laugh when it comes to names. Just somebody's name, a name of a school. Oral Roberts was always Oral Roberts, but nobody talked about Oral Roberts very much. Obviously, they pulled out the unbelievable upset of Ohio State in the first round of the NCAA tournament this year. And obviously, the stupid jokes come out, like people never heard of the school Oral Roberts before. And honestly, when you go out there and you throw stupid jokes about silly names and dumb puns, it shows your own ignorance. Not ignorance in the most evil of way, but ignorance in the fact that you're admitting that you never heard of the school Oral Roberts before. Just like that fan that starts to drink in a baseball game as we're getting close to the 7th inning stretch. The end of the 6th inning is coming, the beginning of the 7th inning. They're starting to feel their alcohol. It's starting to get in their system. It's starting to permeate throughout their body. And they look at the first base coach. And they look at whatever his last name is. And it could be Tom Goodwin. And all of a sudden, they're hearing of Goodwin for the first time. And they're reading it. Oh, it looks like a good win. In other words, they're coming up with corny jokes, basically proving that they have little knowledge about the person they're even referring to. So I had to get that off my chest. Obviously, it's a point that doesn't mean anything at all. But you think of the Sweet 16 now. You think of the struggles of the Big Ten in a tournament this year. And were we deceived? Was the general public fooled into thinking that the Big Ten is better than it even is right now? You think of the Pac-12 and Oregon State and UCLA and USC, and the reasons that you may say that these teams are a little bit better than what they are perceived nationally. Maybe we didn't see it so much over here in the Midwest or the East Coast or down in the Southeast. But what does it look like right now? Well, I look at Gonzaga, I look at Baylor, you look at Michigan, 3 of the number 1 seeds that are still alive. In spite of all these upsets that we've seen in the NCAA tournament this year, which, by the way, if you haven't tuned into it, if you're just a person that says, hey, I try to stay away from the NCAA tournament, you may want to try to follow it a little bit. Because I don't consider myself a college basketball fan. I'm having fun. I'm watching it. It's enjoyable. Most of these games, for the exception of the last slate of games that were played on, what was it, Monday or Sunday? Every one of them seemed to come down to the wire. You're learning a lot about schools that don't get a lot of credit or respect. What it's going to come down to is Gonzaga going to finally win themselves that championship. Mark Few, the head coach at Gonzaga, has the highest winning percentage in the history of NCAA basketball. Can he finally get his championship? And I think that's a great storyline to follow. Are you going to follow the Cinderellas? Is Oral Roberts going to win another game? You look at Oregon State. You look at some of these other teams that didn't have the expectation to do what it is that they're doing. I think there's enough to follow. But then it could get pretty, normalized. You start seeing the 1 seeds getting into the Elite 8, winning their way into a chance to play for the Final Four. And all of a sudden you look and 3 of the 4 number 1 seeds are in the Final Four, and you start to forget about all the upsets that led up to this. Could lead to a deeper discussion about the NCAA tournament. Should it change? Should it be a little bit different? Should there be more teams? Should there be less teams? How do you really judge how good a team is in a regular season? You're looking at their record. Yeah, you're giving certain power to their record against better teams. What teams did they beat for the series of wins that they've accumulated over the course of a season? Did the seeding process this year kind of show a hole in the selection process? Because you know what? Once this is all over, you could go back and reseed the 1 through 16 in the two brackets, and 1 through 18 in the other 2 brackets, and I'm sure the seeding would look a lot different than it did. Ohio State's not a number 2 team. They lost in the first round. I'm sorry. And was it an overrating of Ohio State, or was it an underrating of Oral Roberts? Loyola Chicago blows out Illinois. Is it because Illinois is overrated? Or is it because the selection process severely underrated Loyola of Chicago? These are all things that should be thought about. Is there enough time to really bring this stuff to light? I think what you want is to know that the best 64, now we're talking about 68 teams, which I'm not a big fan of having, an extra 4 teams and having good teams playing each other just to get an 11th seed in a tournament. I think there's better ways they could have done that. And I don't think you need these extra 4 teams in there anyway. Is there too many teams? Is there not enough teams? Most importantly, are there good teams that are left out that really could make a significant enough run in the NCAA tournament? And are there teams that are in the tournament that really had no business being there anyway? First time in a long time, no Duke, no Kentucky. This copyright and broadcast is authorized under internet rights granted by the World Wide Web and is solely for entertainment of our audience. Any publication, reproduction, or other use of the pictures, descriptions, and accounts of this show without the express written consent of the Passball Show, JohnPLA.com and John PLA LLC, is prohibited. Any commercial or other use of the program, such as by charge and admission for its showing, is similarly prohibited. So you heard about the player for Ohio State after their tough loss. Missed a couple free throws. Oral Roberts wins. John Q, Twitter follower, decides to make some really hateful and hurtful statements, basically telling the dude to kill himself. Problem with John Q, Twitter follower, is that he is not going to ever be held accountable for what he says and does. Because he will never be held accountable for what he says and does means that there's going to be 100 other John Q, Twitter followers that are going to grow beer balls and be able to say what it is that they want to say without the ramifications of anybody that is in the spotlight or has a name to them. And you've heard me rant about this for a long time. This is one of my biggest pet peeves. If somebody knows your name and you say something stupid, you're put through the ringer. You are basically accused as being guilty before you have any chance to defend yourself. And even if you prove yourself as innocent, in a court of public opinion, you're still going to be guilty. There's a separate set of standards, and we talk about biasness. Some people talk about priorities where people have a name to them, get that back table in the back of a restaurant because people know their name. But there is an unfair advantage to just being an average and ordinary Joe. You don't have to identify who it is that you are. Right now, nobody cares who John PLA is. I could make a fake handle for whatever sort of social media I want, say whatever I want, and not be held accountable for it. But down the road, I make it on a major network and all of a sudden everybody is forced to know my name whether you like me or not. I have my name attached to every single thing that I say. Problem that we have here is that there is no enforcement on social media of people to identify who it is that they are. And if you ever want to see a change, if you ever want to see less hurtful comments, more people thinking about what it is that they're going to say before they say it, imagine being your everyday employee. We all have to make a living for ourselves. If you hide under a certain Twitter handle, say some demeaning and hurtful things to somebody, nobody ever finds out, there's no accountability. But if it's looked up through an IP address that you are who you are, and your family knows that your name is put behind it, they know what you said and what you did, your friends know what you said and what you did, those that work, like I said on Twitter, in the electronics department at Target with you, know that it's you that said what you said, that person gets put through a similar ringer than somebody that has a name attached to them. Whether it's an athlete, whether it's a personality, whether it's an actor, whether it's an entertainer, whether it's somebody in politics. The bottom line, what they all have in common is the general public knows their name. Now, it doesn't make any of these Joes, these average Joes, popular, but they all have a name, and there's all people that know them. The amount of people that may know them may be less, but maybe it's time to start indicting these people for who they are. Bad people exist all over. They're not just celebrities. Yet we try to crucify celebrities every time they talk out of turn, every time they say something stupid, every time they do something that may be devious, may in some cases be a breachment of the law. We want to make them out to be worse people than they are, yet the majority of average Joe society, John Q. Public, can hide under an assumed handle and say whatever it is that they want without any sort of repercussion. And the reason they don't have any repercussions is not because nobody knows who they are, which we know that's a fact. It's because they don't have to identify who it is that they are. And I can't take anybody's comments seriously. You could call me whatever it is that you want, but if you're not a real person, if you don't have enough balls, gall, dignity, or self-respect to identify who it is that you really are, then your opinion is irrelevant. It's as irrelevant as that cartoon character face that you tried to make of yourself. And I hope that made a little sense. Last thing I wanted to get into is the designated hitter. You're not going to see it. You're going to see it in the National League this year. And I do think there are some ramifications. You could think of pitchers potentially getting injured in a batter's box. And I think that's a little bit of a lazy take. I'm not jumping on that, saying that that's the primary reason why I don't think there should be pitchers hitting in the National League this year. I think it is a little deeper than that. You think of the history of baseball, and up until 1973, of course, we know that there was no designated hitter. The pitchers were expected to hit for themselves. The pitchers took regular batting practice. They were expected to handle their bat. Now, it was understood throughout a team and an organization that the pitchers were probably the weakest hitters on the team. They were on the team because of their ability to throw a baseball. And what they were able to do on the mound was able to prevent runs by throwing a baseball and making it do the crazy things that it did and dominate on the mound. And because of that, it didn't matter how good of a hitter they were. But for years, and once again, I quote the late Eli Gerba, former pitcher for the Yankees and the Angels, and he said it on this show. There was a responsibility that pitchers had to not only not embarrass themselves at the plate, but to be legitimate contributors to the offense of their given ball club. They were supposed to take batting practice. If they didn't take batting practice, if there was a pitcher that ran aloof and said, yeah, it doesn't matter, I'm not going to contribute at all anyway, I don't need to take batting practice, the other teammates would look at him differently. Now you have a league where nobody takes batting practice if you're a pitcher. Towards the end of spring training this year, you had the National League team say, hey, yeah, we'll bring the pitchers up there and we'll have them bunt a little bit. They're not helping their teams. And if you want to talk about the major reason that pitchers will not be hitting in the National League within the next collective bargaining agreement, and once that happens, you will never see pitchers regularly hit in another professional baseball game ever again, it's not all the semantics. It's not the silly rules about how pitchers can't hit. It's the lack of willingness that pitchers have to step in the batter's box. It's the fact that pitchers do not want to take batting practice. It's the fact that pitchers are identified as pitchers as early as age 8, 9, 12, and are basically banned from the batter's box to even take swings and try to hit and try to become better hitters. They're focused on their arm. The scouts and the coaches want to make them into better pitchers so bad that they want them to stay as far away from the batter's box as possible. When they're going with their travel teams, all of a sudden they're getting DH'd for then. How do you expect pitchers to have more of a desire to hit? How do you expect pitchers from a number standpoint to get better and contribute a little bit more? I understand that if you put a professional hitter there for a pitcher, that player is going to hit better. And obviously the gap has been widened between the average batting average and OPS and WAR when it comes to offense of a designated hitter against a pitcher. We understand that the difference between what a designated hitter brings to the table and your average hitting pitcher, the gap has probably never been wider than it is right now. But the reason that's happened is because there's been no effort. Pitchers as hitters have not been considered part of the team. And you're going to watch baseball embarrass itself again, which I don't understand. I mean, you could talk about good reasons why pitchers should hit. You could talk about from a baseball purist standpoint of why a pitcher should get their 3 at-bats. But now that isn't even possible. You got openers. A guy starting a game that likely has never hit or hasn't hit in 5-10 years. They're not going to be up by the time the pitcher spot comes up anyway. So you're talking about a game of 4 pinch hitters instead of 1 designated hitter that's going to get all 4 of those at-bats. And I don't really like the way the game has changed in that regard. We talked about pitchers that used to hold that position, right? That pitcher was expected to pitch innings 1 through 9. And that lasted a lot longer than people give it credit for. We're talking about the 80s, where your top 2 or 3 pitchers on your pitching staff were expected to pitch between 10 and 15 complete games a year. And that was about half their starts. Now a pitcher is rewarded if they pitch 6 innings and give up 3 or less runs. Now a pitcher is just expected to get into the 5th inning. And I understand bullpenning, as much as I may not love it, I understand from a statistical standpoint why it makes sense. You've got, from a matchup standpoint, somebody that throws the ball between 95 and 100 miles an hour. They go out there and they give that team a more or better advantage, a better chance to win a given game. But when we talk about the designated hitter, and I know there's some people out there that still don't want to back off the DH. They don't want to insist that the designated hitter is ever going to take over. They're going to do everything and say everything they can to protect the pitcher's ability to bat. I want to know that there are pitchers outside of the few that'll speak it for a soundbites perspective. Pitchers don't give a damn about hitting. Pitchers are told to not give a damn about hitting. Pitchers are told to give up hitting sometimes, like I said, between the ages of 8 and 12. So between that and the fact that they're not trying and they've given up, they say, hey, if I want to make the major leagues, the only chance I have is to be a pitcher, so I better not swing a bat. Yes, it's sacrilegious when it comes to the all-time baseball players. You want to go back to the 19th century, you want to go back to the beginning of the 20th century, the dead ball era, you'll find that batting averages and OPSs of pitchers were higher, certainly than they are right now. And there was a certain amount of time that went by where pitchers, more pitchers than not, helped themselves. That it wasn't crazy for pitchers to hit 230 for a season with a couple home runs. That's not happening anymore. You may have one pitcher in the National League that hits both over 200 and multiple home runs over the course of the season. And there's good athletes, pitchers. In order to have that stamina and be able to dominate on the mound, you have to be in great shape. So from an athlete standpoint, if you are a really good athlete, you'd have the ability to go out there and probably hit for yourself without a lot of batting practice. This is the Passball Show, brought to you by JohnPLA.com, by St. Aloysius Church in Jackson, New Jersey, by Two Ways, One Passion Food Truck, located in Scranton, Pennsylvania. A little bit of a recap of the show today. Spoke a little bit about Elgin Baylor. Is Elgin Baylor a top 10 player in the history of the National Basketball Association? I got him if you go to JohnPLA.com, where I have a ranking of my top 15 NBA players. And some people say, hey, you should break it down a little more about big men and scorers. But I think it all comes together. I mean, there were times in the NBA that big men were the primary scorers. There's times now where you talk about top scorers that are big men. Big men are shooting threes now. So it's kind of hard to say that you could put them in certain categories. You talk about players that play the power forward and center or play the 1 or 2 guard. I think you could really loop them all together, kind of put them all in a basket. And if you don't have Elgin Baylor, at least right on the peripheries of being top 10, then you're sadly underrating him. I think you should learn a little more about Elgin Baylor. Not the fact that he was the number 3 player on some of the most dominant teams in the history of the NBA with the Lakers. Sure, he wasn't Wilt Chamberlain. He wasn't Jerry West. But if he was the sole player or the sole dominant player on those Laker teams or any other teams, we'd be talking about how great Elgin Baylor was. We'd be talking about him in the same light that we talk about Kobe Bryant. We may even talk about him in the same light that we talk about Michael Jordan. And I don't think that's a crazy statement to make. Unfortunately, when we go back in history, especially when we're so far removed from the time that Elgin Baylor played, remember, this is before Dr. J. This is before Michael Jordan. There were few players in the NBA that could do the things that Elgin Baylor could do. And unfortunately, history holds it against him that his teammates happen to be Jerry West and Wilt Chamberlain. I mean, Elgin Baylor averaged 35 points a season for 3 consecutive seasons over the course of 3 seasons. And his teammate was Wilt Chamberlain, who was averaging over 50 a game. If he was on any other team, he'd be considered one of the biggest scorers in the NBA. Sweet 16, you'll hear this weekend, NCAA. There's still a chance that 3 of the 4 top seeds can make it into the Elite 8. And if you look at Houston as a 2 seed and the bracket where Ohio State got eliminated, imagine having 3 1s and a 2 in the Final 4 when we're talking about a tournament that seems to have more upsets than any other one that I've been part of. How many double-digit seeds made it into the second round or the Sweet 16? You know, how many are there right now, right? It's been a fun tournament. It's been a fun tournament to a point where you've gotten to learn a lot about not so much mid-major schools, but you're starting to understand how deep the Pac-12 is. It's a lot deeper than the Big Ten. Big Ten brought a lot of teams into the tournament, and a lot of them are home. You're looking at just Michigan right now. John Q, Twitter follower. I would hope if we're ever going to get anywhere, we should start holding the average Joe as accountable as we do the celebrity. You know, the average Joe shouldn't hide under an alias name and say anything that they want, because I think 2 things. Number one, they have no accountability held to them. But also, a lot of narratives can be continued to be pushed. Some asshole that goes out there and hides behind some assumed handle can say demeaning things against women. And the general public will normalize that and say that that's what everybody's doing. But it's just one person that doesn't have the balls to identify who they are. And guess what? If these people were going to be held accountable and their names were put behind it, odds are they wouldn't say the things that they say. And you really want to make some progress towards hate speech and prejudice and racism and all these other things that are evil? Force the average Joe to identify who the hell they are. They'll think twice. A lot less hateful, hurtful things will be said. And some of the false narratives that everybody feels this way, you'll realize that more people don't feel that way. DH in the National League, it's inevitable. I don't care how much of a baseball purist you are. And it's not a baseball thing. I'd blame it on pitchers not trying to hit. I'd blame it on teams at the lowest level when you talk about young kids identifying their pitchers and not allowing them to hit from ages 8 to 12. If the bat's taken out of your hand, I can't expect that person at age 25 in the major leagues to be able to help his team when they come up to a plate. I don't care how good of an athlete they are. And it's not just Major League Baseball, it's baseball in general. They've dumbed this down. There's this overvalue on pitching, which, by the way, starting pitching isn't even that important anymore. You don't need starting pitchers to go 5 innings. So why would they ever consider putting a bat in that pitcher's hands? All they got to do is work on their stuff and work on being able to dominate for 2-3 innings or 1 inning or for 3 batters, right? The 3 batter minimum. Unfortunately, baseball should be held responsible, not solely responsible, but all forms of baseball, for the deterioration and the eventual elimination of the designated hitter. In all seriousness, we'll debate whether we want to do a show Saturday. Once again, the Pass Ball Show brought to you by JohnPLA.com. You could check out the Pass Ball Show on Spotify, Apple Music, Amazon Music, YouTube. And I do thank everybody for those that click on the YouTube videos when I use social engineering to kind of throw my videos in your face. I thank everybody that's given the show a shot. Would appreciate a little more comments here and there, but whatever. I'll see you when I see you. God bless you. And as always, I'll see you on the other side.